Hey, it's Broken Office Chair, a podcast produced by Alternatives. Broken Office Chair is hosted by Alternatives Executive Director Bessie Alcantara. Bessie is a Chicago native, first-generation Salvadoran Mexican-American who's passionate about dismantling systemic racism. In each episode, Bessie will be joined by her friends and colleagues who are ready to speak candidly about their experiences as people of color in their various professions. In the episodes, they'll address topics such as issues in the nonprofit sector, racial equity, DEI in practice, and much, much more.
All right. Hello, everyone. I am Bessie Alcantara with Alternatives and the Broken Office Chair podcast. And today we're doing things a little bit differently. So I'm going to talk a little bit about myself and then let Claire do so, who is, for Broken Office Chair, the guest today. So I am part of an organization that's been around for about 50 years, and our main focus areas are restorative justice and behavioral health. I came into this work. My parents are immigrants, and I didn't know there was such a thing as social work. And so I kind of grew up there was only a way to help people. And then after I graduated from college, I kind of fell into this work, learned about it, and I've been doing it ever since. Chicago born and raised, been here my whole life. And yeah, I think that's a little bit about myself. And we came up with Broken Office Chair, really wanting to highlight voices from communities of color and social justice issues and things that really matter to people. And almost like having a conversation that you would normally have in your living room and trying to let others into those conversations. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Claire, to talk about your podcast and yourself a little bit.
Thank you so much, Bessie. My name is Claire de Mézerville López. I am Costa Rican and I live in Costa Rica. And I have been working with the International Institute for Restorative Practices it's going to be formally 7 to 8 years. And before that, as an instructor, ever since 2011. So it's been a while. I am a psychologist, but I was very much drawn to learn from the collective wisdom when groups come together, and that made me fall in love with restorative practices and restorative justice. And Restorative Works is a podcast that we started this year in 2023. So it is my great honor to have Bessie Alcantara as a guest in this shared experience where these two podcasts get the opportunity to share the space and learn from one another. So I am just grateful and very excited that we're having the opportunity to be here today. So Bessie, I'm just going to dive right into it. When we talk about restorative practices, we talk about promoting spaces of empathy and active listening, how to create non-judgmental spaces for creativity, for conflict transformation. And I think the experience of a podcast helps us to learn so much from people and to bring that into our own experience and growth. How has this path been for you?
Oh my God, I feel like this is so much into this, right? Question. So fundamentally, it's one of the things I often talk about is a lot of the issues that exist today would not exist if people practice kindness, compassion, and empathy with others, right? And so I think those are values that are really important to me. And when we kicked off this podcast, one of the things that kept coming up, as a nonprofit, we have a lot of funder relationships, and funders come into our space and wanting to kind of tell us how to do the work sometimes and not having the experience of being on the ground. And so we wanted to have different avenues to kind of push back and really educate others on what creating a shared space looks like. And so that was a little bit of what prompted it. What has come out of it has been so much more amazing than what I have anticipated. I've had folks describe listening to the podcast as a gift. being able to have access to conversations that they would normally not have access to. I've had folks tell me that this is a thing that made them feel seen and felt validated and felt heard for the first time. I've had folks tell me that this is what helped them make that next move in their career and gave them the courage to take that next move. And so I'm really excited with what it's been so far. And for me as a person, it's honestly my favorite part of the job, because I feel like I learn so much from other people and I get to hear their stories. And there's like this mutual therapeutic, almost healing type of relationship that happens when we talk about these issues. And it's been great. I just think it's making me a better person overall. For me, that's what's come up. I don't know what's come up for you in your podcast.
Well, I can relate. I was listening to one of the episodes, and how, as I was listening to, this was with Dr. Shelley Holt, and as we were wrapping up, I was telling her, I feel so restored by this conversation. This has really restored me. And then when the episode aired, I was listening to it again. And as I listened to it, and as I listened to her and her experience, I was just feeling restored again, that I had to email her and let her know, hey, I'm just so appreciative of this. And that has been the case with all conversations, just learning from people's experience. The other thing that has been so meaningful to me is that restorative practices can offer you the how when you really want to have that engagement and that space for voice. And maybe people are in a role of leadership and they really want to have this circular processes of decision making, but don't really know how to. So the tools are there, but I have felt apprehensive of the idea that we're going to solve very complex things with just the one-to-one interaction. And from different guests in the podcast, I have learned how people are really active in organizing, learning from one another, tackling complex issues with a very nuanced and sensitive and reflexive way of saying, we can do something, how can we do it well? So, that has been inspiring me, and it picks me up when I watch the news and feel especially overwhelmed.
There are such amazing people doing the work. And I think that you bring up a really good point, an interesting point, which is the nuances of the work, right? I think one of the things with active listening and practicing empathy that you have to really exercise doing is holding multiple truths at the same time. And I think those one-on-one connections really help people do that, because you get to see other people's perspectives and hold their perspectives as valid and different perspectives as valid as well. And so I think that is one of the really key takeaways from these one-on-one interactions.
And I think it's difficult because I'm reminded of Jean-Paul Lederach and how when he talks about peace studies, and he says, how are we creating space for what he calls improbable dialogues? How are you going to have a dialogue that is very unlikely that you would have, because the other person might have a very different perspective from you? And I was at this event a couple of weeks ago that was very focused on restorative justice across Latin America, where we're working on this volume for the Encyclopedia for Restorative Justice. And one of the things that we were questioning was restorative justice has been put on the same bucket as peace studies. That's not a bad thing. It's probably a good thing, but let's talk about that. Is it the same? Is it the same restorative justice and doing peace studies? But I don't have an answer for that. I will just say that from what I've learned throughout the podcast and throughout the practice is that having those unlikely dialogues can be very uncomfortable. Doing restorative work, it doesn't make it easier. No. But it sets you up in a very honest way to prepare you to sit in discomfort. And I really appreciate it. It's very difficult for me. I can be very impulsive. And as you can tell, I talk a lot. So it has taught me a lot on how to, self-regulate, stop, pause, listen, learn. And that has been a gift to me as a person.
Yeah, I think people forget too that like discomfort is also kind of like a muscle. You have to practice being in it and to get better at it. And, kind of what you just mentioned, being able to self-regulate and not be reactionary and things like that comes from from practicing being in that setting. I think to add to that though, too, is the accountability piece. That could also be really uncomfortable. I had a conversation earlier in which we were talking about a really loaded topic, Israel-Palestine. And I said something that was not said. I didn't say it the right way. And I was fortunate in which the person I was speaking to corrected me immediately. And he understood my intention. And he was like, here's how you could say it better going forward. And I was like, absolutely, you're right. Right. I think practicing difficult conversations allows you to get to that point so that when people correct you and hold you accountable for not saying or not doing the right thing, you can sit with that and keep the conversation going and not get stuck in this moment of shame. I did the wrong thing. I'm so sorry, etc. Right. And so like that's some of the discomfort that you get to practice through having these really difficult conversations.
And it has to do with emotion, which is the difficult part. If it was something that you don't care deeply about, you wouldn't experience so much of an emotion when you realize that maybe you could have done something different. I had a similar experience with one of the podcast interviews. The person mentioned something about, this political issue. And I listened to the person and we continued the conversation. I thought it was very good. And as we finished the recording, speaking with the person, they said, should I have not said that? Is it a problem? And I said, it's not Claire's podcast, it's the IIRP podcast. So I have to be very mindful of not abusing the space for me. But regarding our guests, this should be an open space for people to bring out difficult topics. And I think that's very tricky because some people, especially in Costa Rica, and I think this goes all over the world, but I'm just going to speak for my own context. The punitive culture is very strong. Mm-hmm. So when you talk about restorative practices or you talk about restorative justice or alternative conflict resolution, there's a lot of prejudice that says this is just to be very soft on things and just to keep things kind of quiet without acting on them. And I feel that prejudice is so dangerous because we're actually doing very difficult, vulnerable work.
Yeah.
Talking about very difficult and vulnerable topics. And how do you do that without creating more harm or trying to prevent that as much as possible, but at the same time remaining hard and direct on the issues that we need to talk about, instead of just moving around them in these negative P's because we want to avoid conflict.
And this came up for me when you mentioned sitting restorative practices under peace building, because I think it is one tool in the toolkit towards peace building. I don't know that it's as simple to say that that's what it is. But I think in the US context, we've become so ridiculously polarized that if you don't agree with me 100%, then obviously you don't have the best interest at heart and we can't talk about this anymore, and cancel culture and all of these different things. And so we've almost gone so extreme on both sides in terms of our opinions that like we can't have a conversation anymore. And so I do believe that it is a skill towards peace building, because of I think that's where it starts, is conversation. That's what diplomacy is a conversation, right? Before we get to violence and bombing innocent people and everything else going on in the world right now.
I saw this quote from Sigmund Freud that said, the day the person threw an insult instead of a rock, that's when civilization was born. I'm not sure if I fully agree with the phrase. There are many layers. I will not endorse throwing out insults. I will say that. I will say, though, that we need to use our words. And if we don't, things are just going to stay the way they are. And what benefit is that bringing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I tend to be very nonviolence oriented in general. And so that's my bias. And I agree, though, because I think we also, when we say things like that quote, we miss the fact that words could also have very real trauma and impact and harm on folks, right? And so it kind of minimizes. It's like that old nursery rhyme, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. I'm like, no, they absolutely do hurt.
Yes, they hurt. They hurt. I remember many years ago when we had this training in peace circles here in Costa Rica. And this person, very experienced, she was mentioning how people were a little concerned that there was this woman in the circle that got really angry and just got a little, she stood up, she said very hard things to the person that she felt was doing injustice to her. And when they asked the facilitator later, how do you feel about that? And she said, there was a situation of power there where it was good that her anger could be a part of the circle. And I think that's very complex because you believe in establishing norms, creating a space that is safe. You really want to do that, knowing that it's not a therapeutic space. It's a community space, and you want to keep the community space safe in situations where there's a lot of emotion going on.
Yeah. But I think that also just goes to, as a society, what we view as good or bad, and conflict is inherently bad. And there's emotions that are inherently bad to folks, right? I'm not saying this is my opinion. And I think anger is one of those things that we just see as a bad thing. And we have a discomfort in sitting with anger. And this also goes back to the comment around having multiple truths. And I also wrestle with this because it's like some injustices are so big and strong and just overpowering that anger is the only appropriate response. And how do you hold folks' anger and also not have people feel disrespected, right? And so this idea of tone policing, oh, you can't say that, you can't do that. You don't want to do that either, because people's feelings are so valid. And also it's really valid to feel hurt by this anger. And so working through that space and it is the difficult work. Every situation is so different on how you work through it, but that is part of the work that we have to do.
It is an important work to do. During this training with this organization, one of the persons participating was very insistent on, when someone voices something that is bothering them, it's so important that we turn it to the positive, that we focus their attention on what was. So I challenged that a little bit. I try to be very, very polite, make the person feel comfortable, and also say, so when are we going to have the space to speak about discomfort and about anger and about things that need to change? And I think there may be very, very good intentions on trying to be very positive and very optimistic and be grateful for the good things. The courageous conversations are necessary.
Mm-hmm. I love the term toxic positivity.
Yeah.
Because I think that is a point that we've gotten to a lot in trying to turn things into something positive. I do like being solution oriented, but sometimes feelings are just feelings and they need to be processed. And we can't just be and here's what we're going to do about it right this moment.
They are telling us something. Feelings are telling us something. And it's a message to understand and not just to control. Now, Bessie, I have a question for you, though.
Sure.
Alternative has collaborated with the Education Lab and CPS to evaluate the effects of restorative practices in Chicago. That's correct, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what has been that like, I imagine it must have been very exciting to see it on such a large scale. Chicago is really big.
Yeah, we have the third largest school system in the country. And we actually, the education lab was doing this study initially, and we didn't know about it. And so in conversation, it came out that we were one of the organizations that they were studying, because it's a longitudinal study. So it was like, it started before my time at Alternatives. Oh. And there is so much negative conversation around restorative practices, in that it's, I think you alluded to this earlier, that it's just warm and fuzzy and there's no accountability, and it's about making people feel good, right? And so I think there's still a lot of hesitation around using restorative practices. And what the study found was that coaching, which is what we do, has a high degree of effectiveness, even more so than just training people on RP practices. And so like the difference is, right, training is like you take people through a series of workshops and you send them out into the world. What we do is that we go into the classroom with the teachers, and we say, and we watch them implement the work, and then we say, here's how you could do it better. We model the services, et cetera. And we also do this with the young people. And not only did they show this to be effective, but I think one of the really cool things that came out of the work was that it decreased out of school arrests for young people. And so some folks may be like, oh, it's because you stopped getting kids in trouble in schools. But no, something happened that when young people went home, they were less likely to get arrested, engage in behavior that got them arrested less. And so I think that's a question that like should have more digging into.
Yeah.
But I think that there's something, what that says is that there's something really right about giving people the skills and tools to basically use their words.
Yeah. I love that. We, at the job that I have here, talk a lot about the school to prison pipeline.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And we talk about how, well, maybe having a strong sense of community and belonging when you are at school can help.
Yes.
And we kind of think that makes sense. Somehow the evidence points out that makes sense. We're still doing the punitive thing.
I know. And I don't think it's, again, you mentioned this, I think it's everybody. We did a conference, a workshop in Europe, and one of the things that blew my mind was how many people wanted to talk to us afterwards because of the punitive practices in which their school was implementing. And somebody told me that they called the police because a student punched another student. And they brought the police department for that. And then I'm just like, it doesn't have to escalate to that degree. And I think it's really interesting to hear you talk about this from Costa Rica's standpoint, because I've always perceived Costa Rica to be more peaceful because, correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't that one of the countries that doesn't have an army?
That is correct. And we celebrated our national holiday of the abolition of the army. Abolition, that's a word in English, right? I said it correctly. Yes. That was last Friday, December 1st, was a holiday here. 1948, we abolished the army.
And have you seen any, that's an extreme move, right? To not have an army, especially in this day and age. And have you seen any trickle down into other policies from that?
Yes. So, and I wanted to mention also an example from our context. Jose Figueres Ferrer decides to abolish the army after the Civil War, and he takes on the role of interim president. And there was an expectation that he might want to stick around, but he opened for elections that he did not want. So it was kind of a surprising positive step towards democracy.
Yeah.
In the midst of everything that was going on in Central America. And I think that did trickle down into the policies that then were approved in the 1990s, including the juvenile justice law that was very progressive. The alternative conflict resolution law, those are all laws from 1990s that were very, very progressive, very human oriented, very social and educational oriented towards the way that justice was handled in juvenile. And then we had the restorative justice pilot program starting in 2012, became law in 2018. So we have strong juvenile justice processes, but they work mostly with alternative sanctions. So the situation with Costa Rica is quite interesting. Mm-hmm. We are very progressive, very social and educational oriented to peace. The abolition of the army led to that budget being focused on health and education, which was very good. Our insecurity rates right now in Costa Rica are terrible. They are horrific. Situation with organized crime and escalation of violence is tremendous. So there's a lot of voice saying we need to change all of those laws because they did not work. We need to become more punitive. We need to become more hard on crime. We need to treat juveniles as adults. So we're having all of that, those currents going on right now. Whereas I speak to people and I say, well, actually, those policies are the ones that protected us from everything that has been going on with organized crime in the whole region. That has been terrible, but you can only hold the fort for so long. And the thing that happens is that once crimes reach a certain level of violence, we are one of the countries in the regions with the longest prison sentences for kids. Oh, wow. We can sentence a child to 15 years of prison. And you don't see that in other countries in Latin America. And because of the research project that we work on is with the juvenile facility. We have kids that were arrested when they were 12 and they are being let out when they are 25.
And when they are, my assumption is if they've been locked up for that long, you're lacking social skills, you're lacking like conflict resolution, positive conflict resolution, like you're lacking so much in terms of human development. How does
you spend all your developmental years in the institution?
Yeah.
And so it is a huge problem because also the preparation to re-enter society after incarceration is one of the weakest links on the institutionalizing process. But that has also to do a lot with the juveniles that go to jail are very few population. Like right now in the facility there are, if I'm not mistaken, about 65 kids between 12 and 23. And what happens is that most of the population goes to alternative sanctions. It's only on the most serious cases that you go to the tremendously punitive measures. But those most serious cases are also the most complex cases, where you have a lot of poverty going on, kids that have been in institutions ever since, they were born. It is just very onto the extremes. But then hear the other thing out, because there's a strong restorative justice program for alternative sanctions. There are some restorative measures that you can use when you're dealing with a justice issue or with a judicialized issue that you cannot use at a school. For example, doing restorative processes is forbidden in bullying situations in schools.
Oh, interesting.
Because the idea is that if you make a face-to-face meeting between the person that suffered the bullying and the person that is doing the bullying, there's just a lot of risk of re-victimization. So it is forbidden. You cannot do that. And I can understand the reasons behind that. But if the matter gets judicialized, and I was actually a participant of a restorative conference when this happened, because there was a life-threatening situation. So there was it went into justice. It wasn't on the school anymore. It went into justice, and justice was able to do a restorative justice process on the situation. And during the restorative justice process, you realize that, there was neurodiverse situation with this kid that sent a life threat in a situation where his peers have been terrorizing him for years. And you were able to do something about it besides suspending the kid. Mm-hmm. But those are the things when you see, I can understand the reasons what you would say, no, let's not do a restorative justice conference in this situation. I can see that. But then do the traditional thing that you also know doesn't work.
Yeah.
I think those are the conversations that we're still not having enough.
I think one of the things that's coming up for me, because it sounds like Costa Rica is further ahead in its policies than the U.S. is, right? I think we're still very much using the justice system as our default disciplinary process. But one of the things that's coming up for me as I'm listening to you is like the interconnectedness of it all. You're in the middle of Latin America that is really unstable right now for a variety of reasons. And so it's coming into, I love your cat. It's
so, always wants to do the Lion King thing.
And then even how the systems work with one another and things like that. And so like the need for these conversations is also coming up even more, because even if Costa Rica is doing, and I'm putting this in quotation, the right thing, if everybody else is still failing to uphold their version, their part in the process, then we're still landing at some of the same similar situations, right?
Yeah, I remember when Simone de Beauvoir was talking about women's rights and situations, and she said it takes only one political crisis to have things rolling back.
Yeah.
You must always be alert. And I just see the same situation when it comes to youth and when it comes to juvenile justice, because we might have very progressive landscapes and then a population that is saying, oh, what we need is what's going on in El Salvador, which are, situations where human rights are just considered expendable because insecurity is such an emergency. And I was talking to this restorative justice expert from Argentina, this brilliant woman, and we were talking about how that very punitive discourse comes from a place of hurt. Yeah. And we need to understand that and to validate that instead of just saying, oh, what you're saying is very regressive. We need to be very progressive about justice, and just to understand where is people coming from when they are saying, we just really want crime to stop.
Yeah.
We just feel very desperate because insecurity is so high. I mean, I get it.
But that's the ability to hold multiple truths at the same time.
Yes.
And again, I feel like in the US, at least, we've come so far from that. I feel like every topic is so ridiculously polarized at this point that it's so hard to have any sort of meaningful conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. We need to start little by little, though, because you can injure yourself doing this work.
Yes.
Especially because things sometimes seem really somber. I found this quote, and I don't know where it comes. I would really like to find the book where it comes from, but from Gilles Deleuze, this French philosopher, that said how joy is a form of resistance because sadness is so easily controlled.
Yes.
I get it, but at the same time, I feel so apprehensive about not going into a toxic positivity and say, okay, how can I remain cautiously optimistic, but at the same time, kind of realistic because things doesn't look so well. But how do you not allow yourself to go down that sad place? And I found that people that have come to the podcast are so much better at that than I am.
I also feel like one of the things that happens when you can hold multiple perspectives and multiple truths at the same time is that you tend to overanalyze all of them. And like, like almost get yourself stuck in not wanting to do one thing or the other or do the wrong thing because you're considering every single perspective. And that's what's coming up for me when I'm hearing you. I was like, yeah, I get that. I also just call it, I'm a Virgo. So I always say that I'm Virgoing a situation. I'm overanalyzing it to death.
I do that. I'm an admitted overthinker.
But I think it's funny because the overthinking is what's so helpful so much in doing the work, but then it can get you stuck in a specific place sometimes.
Yeah. So as we record this, we're reaching the end of the calendar year. Mm-hmm. What are your hopes for the broken office chair as 2024 is starting to feel closer and closer?
Oh my God. It's funny. I don't typically get questions asked of me. So now I'm like, ooh, wait. I think one of the things that we're working on right now is trying to get like some of our guests going. I think I have like nervousness each season of trying to like keep up the interest of the previous season because we've grown from the first to the second. But I think like just continuing to get really cool people on there. I really hope that like our reach expands. I have liked every single one of our guests. I think every single guest has had something really powerful to say that people should hear. And so I think my biggest hope would be for it to like expand its reach. That would be mine. What about you?
I love that. Well, Restorative Works is still very much of a baby podcast. So I feel so grateful that we've had the opportunity to learn from people that I couldn't even have imagined that I would get to meet. So that was extremely exciting. And it still feels like a beginning. It still feels a little bit like a birth. But I keep remembering about Miguel Tello. Miguel was the one that first introduced me to restorative practices and restorative justice. He has been very much a friend of him and a mentor. And last year, as we were on his birthday, of course we did a circle. How could we not? Of course we did a circle. And as we all talked about how Miguel has impacted our lives, he wrapped it up and he said, if I could ever be something, I would like to be a bridge. And I just thought, I'm going to take that to myself. And that's kind of my hope for Restorative Works, for everything that we do. How do we continue to be a bridge, continue to build this, network of people that are doing a lot of work? And I think it just gets better as we know more of each other and as people get to learn, this other person is doing this that kind of relates to what I'm doing. Maybe I can connect with them, and that gives me a lot of hope. It gets me going.
Have you heard people say, like, don't meet your idols? Because there's this idea when you meet people that you look up to, they disappoint you. Yeah. And one of the cool things that has happened through this podcast is that I've met people that I've looked up to for years, and I've gotten to meet them finally, right? And then I have to like not be the fangirl, like, oh my God, I've looked up to you for years, right? One of the cool things that has happened is I've met these people that I've looked up to, and they're actually just as dope and amazing as I've always perceived them to be. And so like, that's why I keep saying, like, there's so many amazing people doing such amazing work. And like, personally, my hope would be that I could like, just be like a fraction as cool as some of them are. I'm like, I want to be that impactful. And so I think that's been one of the most amazing things for me, is that not only the folks I meet not disappoint, but like I have even more respect and admiration for the people that I've been meeting.
I love that. Can I steal your answer? I will just say, yeah, what he said. That's good for me. I like that. Yes, and I can relate to that when I was saying about this. Just keep doing the work, be courageous, show up, do what you're doing, and how these guests are so much better than I am at doing it. And then I realized, life can feel overwhelming sometimes, and sometimes you might question if what you're doing in your work is really working. But then you realize all the people that are doing all of this work and the way that they are doing it and the way that is multiplying with their communities and with everyone that is working with them. And you realize, we should keep going. There's good stuff going on, not as a distraction. It should not be a distraction, but I think it should be an engine, a motor to keep going and to keep going connected. I feel very fearful about good works that are never known.
But I think that's why platforms like this are so important, to try to find those voices and elevate them.
Yeah.
Well, we actually hit time. It was so good to talk to you.
You're kidding. That really went fast.
Yes, it does. Yep.
Bessie, I feel so honored to share this conversation with you. It's been restoring to me, too.
I loved our conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Yeah.
And I'm jealous. I want to be there.
Well, you should come. It is very nice today. You should come. So, you have a home here whenever you're passing by Costa Rica. I don't live on the beautiful touristic part. But anyways, you should stop by. And
my cousins are Costa Rican. They have a home in San Jose.
Oh, well, so we'll have dinner with them. There you go. Tell them that I invited myself.
Okay, perfect.
And the other thing, as I wrap up the podcast, I always like to remind myself of this, this Ubuntu lesson, take care of others and also take care of yourself. And because one always comes with the other. So yes. Thank you so much for this. It has been great.
Thank you.
Keep up with everything going on at Alternatives, or to donate, you can visit us at our website, alternativesyouth.org. You can also follow us at Alternatives Inc. on Instagram or at Alternatives Youth on Facebook. If you want to keep up with Bessie, you can follow her on Instagram and TikTok at Bessie_Alcantara. Thanks for listening.